Hello,
I
friends.
actually have 3 different machines sitting in front of me right now. This is special.
Yeah, because more machines is clearly better, right? You're more efficient at development when you have more machines, right? You can do 3 things at once.
Yeah. Yes. Well, what ends up happening is I type on this nice keyboard right in front of me, and it goes to one of the 3 machines at random, and it's always like an egg hunt to try to figure out where I actually typed. Also, orange juice or mimosa.
I was about to say something inappropriate, but it's mimosa. All right, so then let's go through it. Jeremy, do you want to do us the honor for the next 2 hours?
Try and limit it to 1. Okay, so this is the changes from rounds 1 and 2 of when we were talking about this feature. The biggest one from round 2 will be where got rid of the AsnValue reader and replaced it with a bunch of static helper methods. So a lot of this should be easy and just making sure we're happy with the shape, but then the new ASN decoder class will be a little bit bigger. The biggest change is we talked about at the end of last Thursday's meeting, the namespace. We seem to have landed on system.formats.asn1. So there's that. And we got rid of the into contents accelerator for the meta tag, and in the ASN1 tag class, I had a try decode without a decode, so I added the decode. Not a big deal here.
Where do I see the decode? Oh,
right there.
Okay.
Right. So originally, when this library was written, it was replacing a shim layer we had over Windows, where if it failed, we got a cryptographic exception. So everything was written to throw a cryptographic exception for compat. But since this is being designed on its own now, there's anywhere that would have previously thrown a cryptographic exception, I've introduced a new exception for it that I called ASN content exception. It looks like an exception. Pretty sure it has serializable in the serializable constructor, but they didn't show up in the refgen.
Well, the constructor should have, because the constructor would have been protected, right?
So I'll note that I should look for the serialization constructor.
Yeah, I mean, the attribute probably doesn't, because we generally don't show attributes in the diffs unless you opt in, and then it's usually a mess because we generate every single thing, which you usually also don't want. Yeah, so the thing I don't understand, you said for compat reasons, but this thing is new. So why did we ever go through cryptographic exception?
So all of the code that is driving this got written in 2.0, I think. This is how long it's taken to have time to go through API review.
Please tell me it's .NET Core 2.0 though, not Whitby, because that would be depressing.
So as part of the cross-platform work, we've had to do more and more manual parsing to get consistent answers between Windows, Mac, and Linux. And so this coming out is just a full product. It was an evolution of that. So when I wrote up the original proposal, or the original code, it had cryptographic exception. When I brought it up for the previous proposal, I had cryptographic exception, which made sense because we were burying it under cryptography, but then we lifted it out of cryptography because it didn't really belong there.
Right.
So
makes sense.
All right. So unless anybody has any objections to the name ASN content exception, we can move on to easy hard part.
So this div right now is meaningless, supposedly, right? Because I don't think you replaced AsnValue reader with AsnDecoder, did you?
I did.
Oh, okay.
So at the end of the part 2, we got to, and here's the ref struct version of the reader with the you got to, I think you had the comment of enjoying my conflict of the thing I proposed and the rules that I wrote in the book.
Yes. I mean, like,
and so this is the output of that, of replace the ref struct with a bunch of just static utility methods.
Right.
So it's the same as the ref struct, except the 2 constructor parameters are now 2 formal parameters on every method, and it doesn't save state.
I like this because it reminds me of Win32, and that's my comfort blanket.
I think nobody ever said this about Win32.
Right. So yeah, ASN decoder is the name I came up with for replacing the value reader, because every method on it is decoding. So all of the state information goes away, which is the first block of removed members, and then now we'll start seeing the shape of everything else. So read encoded value used to take no parameters because it just used the constructor state. Now the data, which is now named source, and rule set are now formal parameters to read encoded value, and every member on this class will out the bytes read value. And so in this case of read encoded value, it's returning a net standard 2.0 compatible range, aka it tells you where to start and how long to go. The range type is not in net standard 2.0, so I can't use it here.
So I'm not seeing the range. Is that further down or?
So read encoded value, you have two outs that are scrolling off the right hand side.
Oh, I see. So by returning you mean parameters. Okay, that makes more sense.
Did you say that the only reason you're not using range is because it wasn't net standard compatible?
Correct.
So another tick in the column for we really should consider making it net standard compatible, because we have other projects that are running into the exact same issue where we're contorting the API surface to work around the fact that the type doesn't exist down level.
Yeah, I was about to say that. Like, I generally don't like when we do unnatural acts just for down level compatibility. At that point, I'd rather we oop the type. I mean, it's not. I mean, we have done this before, right? We have just, what is it, hash code, whatever, where we literally put a single type in an oop. Yeah, I think that makes more sense to me. Like, if, I mean, I don't know whether, I mean, did you try range? Would you be happy with it, or is it just like, I thought about it, but then I immediately dismissed it, so I didn't design it.
I'm pretty sure I tried it and I got a compiler. If we added it to a package for net standard 2.0 compatibility, then I would have been missing that reference, but I don't.
No,
my recollection is.
Yeah, no, I meant more like, did you design it and did you like the design, or did you just consider it, notice that it's not in .NET Standard 2.0 and then just immediately gave up?
Right. Well, if you see, so read encoded value, it reads a source and a rule set, and then now if you drag and everything behaves correctly, so we can see the out parameters, it's outing content offset, content length, and then bytes read. And so if range was available, it would out range, content range, and int bytes read, because bytes consumed. That is the name that we have decided, not bytes read.
Yeah, so it sounds like in this case it actually would be a natural out type. If it were one of those situations where it was like, take it or leave it, then whatever. But yeah.
Right, and that's, I think, the only place that range would have shown up, and so it's an offset and a length instead of a compacted range, so it doesn't really change much. If range was in net standard 2.0, I would have used it here.
Sure.
How does the offset work? Is it not at the beginning of source?
So in ASN, or rather Burr encoded data, the first byte will be the first byte in the tag, which is the return value, and that could have been multiple bytes, and then the length telling you how long the content is could have been multiple bytes, and then now you are at the first byte of the content. So content offset will generally be 2 for a small value and maybe up to 8 for a complicated payload. And then content offset plus content length is usually the same as bytes consumed, but bytes consumed can sometimes be 2 bytes longer.
Okay. And then, so the range would be in the source that you passed in. This would be the content start. So both of these ints or range would be relative to the source.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Or yeah, they're both relative to source sub-0. So, yeah. So if you wanted to look at the content bytes, you would call read encoded value, and then where you already had the span, you would slice that to content offset comma content length.
Interesting.
And then that's where range would be even better, because you would just say source sub that range.
Yeah. And so then the try value, or the try version, I put the return value as the first out, because that seemed to be the most logical flow of the try, outs, the tag, the content offset, the content length, and the bytes consumed. Yeah. So then, excuse me. For things, so read Boolean being the simplest of all the things that you can read. So you give it a source and a rule set, and then it will out the bytes consumed, which is how much you need to move forward to get to the next value. And it like all the other read methods that are for a data type, asterisk, take a defaulted nullable ASN1 tag. So the default, or null being, use the universal type that's appropriate to this data type. And if you had anything from the application, context specific or private tag universes, then you would just pass those.
Right. And then all the ones you had try copy, you don't have try copy anymore at all?
So in the second round, we replaced all the try copies to try reads, so that we didn't introduce new verbs.
Yeah.
So that's, I mean, I can point right there, but it's sort of the third green line on your screen right now. Try read bit string,
Yep.
source destination.
Yep, I can see that.
And so because that one is a read and copy, it outs its local data, the unused bit count, which is special to bit string, and then bytes consumed, and then bytes written. Because that matches the order that we said to do it for operation status methods.
Makes sense.
And yeah, so that's going to be the general shape of everything here. So the value reader had the same shape as the reader. Apply the transformation, and then the same stuff here of the constructor parameters become the first two formal parameters, except for the try copy, where destination, or where I follow the rule that destination always follows source. So it's source, destination, rule set. Yes, that's true. And yeah, there was the suggestion to use bit array as a supported type for named bit list values. So that's on here as well. So read named bit list, yada yada yada, returning a bit array. Again, if this round we want to say no, actually we hate that type, don't add it, then deleting things is certainly easy. And then, yeah, so that's going to be the case of everything until strings, the weird one. All right, strings are not weird on this one. They'll be a little weirder when we get to changes in the reader. All right, so anybody have anything about the shape of the decoder here?
I mean, it seems like it's largely just applying the feedback we set, so it seems fine to me.
So if someone did want the ref struct version of the reader, it's very easy to write on top of this. It's just mechanical. Name everything the same thing and just call slice on bytes consumed.
Do you have on here like helper methods that return the length of the incoming tag, like the number of bytes that was required to encode the length of the tag?
So ASN1 tag, if you already have a built tag, it can tell you how it has a method calculate encoded size, which tells you how long in bytes that tag would be.
Sure, and it's illegal in ASN1 to have an overlong tag, correct?
Right. Tags have to use their minimum encoding, no matter what encoding rules that is.
Okay. The context behind that question is I was trying to figure out like if somebody could build a full-featured reader that also keeps track of like every single byte that's in the incoming stream and what was in it. Okay, great.
Yeah. The only thing that's not exposed is specifically encoding and decoding length. The multi-byte compacted format / lax format for Burr.
Okay.
But you could reason about, oh, this tag would have been this long, so I know that bytes 2 through 5 were the length. Like you could make a painter for it, and you would understand the length because we told you the content length. So it can all be semantically done, just some of it's a little juggly. Okay. So, all right. So if we're happy with that, then we can move down to AsnReader. So there was some feedback on the design of, in particular, for read UTC date, where we have a parameter of what's your 2-digit year max, and for reading a set of where we have the option of skip sort validation, that it would be nice to encode those as state in the reader. So in addition to the simple constructor that takes the encoding rules, there's now a AsnReader options, which is the encoding rules plus those two things. So when we get to the members that have extra inputs, they can read those from, or they'll get their defaults from the encoding options, or the simple constructor that takes just the encoding rules will use the things that would have been the default values in a default parameter.
So
Yes.
Are the options mutatable?
No.
Any reason why you don't expose them then?
Because I deconstruct it and.
They're like the container rule set and.
Or sorry. I don't know. We have to scroll down again because I did this like a week or two ago. I don't remember if I made it mutable so that you could use easy initializer patterns because the init-only feature hasn't shipped yet, or not. But I know that definitely the reader, this constructor shreds the reader options into values that it wants. I think I did make it read-write so that you could use object initializer.
Okay, so that's it. That's why I don't expose it, right? Because then it would be mutable after.
Or I'd have to rebuild it on every read.
Yeah. That makes sense then.
So if a quick question on the options. So it looks like the options is a struct, which means that it needs to have some kind of default value for the ASN encoding rules. What would that default value be?
0.
Is that legal?
0 is Burr. So if you pass
yeah.
default AsnReader options, you'll get Burr.
So does that mean that the AsnReader constructor should default ASN encoding rules to Burr as well? For the constructor that takes a rule set but no options?
Well, I mean, the struct you'd have to, like, it's not a defaulted struct. You'd have to say default of AsnReader options. You could say default of rule set if you want. But I don't expect anyone to use default of AsnReader options. The type does have, I mean, it'll always have a parameterless constructor because it's a struct, but the default flow is you would say new, and IntelliSense would tell you there's a constructor and it takes an ASN encoding rules.
Okay. It just seemed odd to me that I could call the constructor overload of AsnReader passing in new AsnReader options parameterless constructor, so I don't have to specify the rules. But if I call the constructor that explicitly takes the rules, I have to specify it. Like that just seemed like a disconnect to me. But if we don't expect anybody to ever call the parameterless constructor on the struct, then so be it.
Yeah, it's certainly not an expectation that I would have.
Okay.
But basically, you need to have a rule set, right? Always, right? That's the idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's at least trying to make it look like you have to always have specified one. Default, of course, is always a valid. Default of T is always a valid expression.
Yeah. Okay.
Default is sometimes a valid expression. All right. So then again on this one, we see the general shape of there used to be overloads of thing and thing taking a tag as the first parameter. Now it's thing, or only one thing which takes a tag as the last parameter, defaulted to default, which means use the appropriate tag.
I like that. Lots of overloads going out the window.
Yep. So read bit list value returns a bit array. Where's UTC time? Okay, so read set of and read UTC time, which are a little bit lower. Keep going.
Yeah, I just try to actually at least pretend that I'm reading it.
Fair enough.
Damn it, my screen froze again. Here we go.
Okay, so read set of and read UTC time, which are both in the center of the screen right now. So these both have overloads still. The simple overload, which just has the nullable tag, it will use the value that was specified from AsnReader options, and the if you want a specific 2-digit year max for this call to read UTC time, then you can specify it as a formal parameter. Similarly with read set of, it'll use the options. The default is false, meaning it will validate sort order validation if the encoding rules required sort or sets to be sorted correctly. And 2-digit year max is whatever the right answer is for X509 certificates. Since max is inclusive, I think it's 2049. So those are the only two kind of new things that were introduced on the reader. And then we could see the AsnReader option struct, the next thing.
Yeah, and just to confirm, like for things like read sequence, you explicitly did not have try overloads. Like that was intentional.
Correct. So the only tries that exist are try copies. So try read character string can fail because you don't give it a big enough destination. The try never. If you have the wrong tag, it will throw.
Sure. Well, you have things like try read uint 32, try read uint 64, which out to ints and longs.
Yes, and they return false if it's out of range. They throw if it's not.
Oh, okay. Okay, got it.
Yeah, I think we discussed that last time, right? Mismatching tags are considered bugs.
So if one more quick question on that then. So if I have a value, say 10 billion, encoded in the incoming ASN structure, and I call try read int 32, it's going to return false if it had a well-formed value of 10 billion inside of it, right?
Correct.
Is the internal state of the reader mutated by that operation? Like, can I call try read uint 64 and expect that to succeed? Or did it skip?
If the try returns false, it's the same as if you didn't call it.
Okay, got it.
Same with the try read character string, try read bit string, and try read octet string. It's you need to try again.
Sure. And if a method throws an exception, then like most types, we just don't make any guarantees about the internal state of a structure at that point.
If it throws an exception because the tag is wrong, then the state is not modified. If it throws an exception, I guess if it throws an ASN content exception, the state is not modified. If it throws a weird exception, then it's in a weird state.
Okay.
But in general, slicing is. I mean, actually, I can tell you from the representation, it always calls the decoder. If the decoder succeeds, it slices. So in this case, with the way it's implemented, it either is not modified or any exception would result in not modifying state.
The reason I asked is I've fielded some customer questions over the past few months about like, hey, is it safe to try catch this operation and then call back into the reader or back into the writer? And I responded with, normally when an instance method on a type throws an exception, we say that that instance is dead at that point normally. But if we want to make other guarantees here, we should just document them.
That's fair.
Really, are we saying the instance is dead at that point?
Yeah, if something throws an exception, like by definition, something exceptional has happened.
No, by definition, the method could not complete its task.
Yes, but if the method could not complete its task,
explicitly do not say exceptional behavior.
Sure, fair. But if a method could not complete its task, there is no guarantee that the method left the instance in its original state.
Right. I mean, again, it all depends on if it's throwing a designed, a designed exception or a, hey, in the middle of this operation that I may have been doing multi-slicing, we oomed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, in fairness, like when I think of exception handling, I usually think of multi-frames, and then you probably, at the point where you're handling it, you typically don't have access to the instance, so it's probably, like, I just couldn't think of a case where I ever thought about that.
Yeah.
The questions that I was fielding were with regard to things like StreamReader, where like I read from the stream and then I failed. I can't unread from the stream again. Like I have by definition mutated the state of the underlying stream in order to attempt to do my work.
Right. Because streams are streams.
Yeah.
Okay, so for the reader options, effectively I designed it as a class and then made it a struct, which is why it has a get only rule set that's a required constructor parameter, but then it's a struct. We can make it all or fully loosey-goosey, like just get set with no formal constructor, but I do like that it tells you, like, it gives you the big hint of like, this is a thing that you should have an opinion about.
So, do you expect this type to grow?
Probably not.
Because if we add 2 more things to it, then at some point it's like, yeah, it probably should have been a class.
Yeah, I mean, we can go either way. I mean, I can say that because skip sort order verification is a Boolean, and the ASN encoding rules only use 2 bits, and UTC time 2-digit year max is limited to the number 10,000. This is actually only 1 int. It's a fancy int. So it has a ways to go before it would exceed the 24-byte heuristic.
Yeah, in that case, I mean, at that point, setters are easier, right?
So is that drop the formal constructor and just make everything get set?
Yeah, I mean, like, it avoids the whole problem with the, you knew up as an options, you didn't pass in anything, and then, well, how do I set anything now? It's like, it just seems from a usability standpoint, there's no downside of having setters, and it usually results in better usability. I mean, we would only make the rule set settable probably, right? Because the other 2 values are inferred, I suppose.
The other 2 values are settable.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay, then in that case, yeah, make the rule set settable and call it a day, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, basically it's, I was trying to express that ASN encoding rules is still a thing that you should have an opinion about. Essentially saying default of AsnReader options is probably not what you want, even though it may be what you want.
I mean, the only downside with not making it a constructor parameter is basically the validation issue, right? Because if you don't pass one in right now you have another rule set, and now you pass that to somebody else. But I guess in options, the general expectation is that the party, like the options type themselves, are usually not in a position to validate anything, because usually you can set things independently, and then the entry point is usually the thing that you actually pass the options to. And then that part is usually the one that validates that the combinations of options you pass make sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, this constructor does validate, as do the 2 sets. I mean, sorry, the Boolean set doesn't validate that you gave it the standard .NET true. But the UTC time 2-digit year max will throw if you give it a
Sure, like
number out of range.
For atomic values that makes sense, right? But I mean, usually it's like, well, options are usually there's combinations of things, and then certain combinations are nonsensical or whatever, and usually the type that exposes them is not the party that validates that. So in that sense, I don't think it would be bad to remove the required parameter either. Like, it seems within the general flow of how options work.
Okay, I mean, so the other another potential way of doing this is to remove the ASN encoding rules, and instead of having the constructor that takes an ASN encoding rules, and then the alternative being a constructor that takes the options, make it be a constructor that takes encoding rules and either overload or default taking an options. Okay. So that you still, that would make it where you are more, searching for options would have been better. Yeah, you missed it.
Well,
it's the beginning of the type that you're in the middle of the diff of.
I don't see it.
Went too far again. Search for ASN encoding options. There's ASN reader options.
Oh, there's encoding options. Yeah, no, I mean like where are the rules themselves?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay, never mind. Okay. Oh, it's just an enum. I see.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Right. So to keep the encoding rules is a decision someone has to make to the reader. Instead of having the rules built into the reader options, I could take them out of the reader options and then just make this, or change the shape of the constructor overload to take a rule set, comma, and options.
And this is all under the guise of like, we really want the caller to care about the rule set, correct?
It feels important to me. I can't extremely articulate why, but
you can't default them, right, in a meaningful way.
The default, yeah, I mean, the default you would get for the reader, like Burr is the most lax, so it would be the most forgiving option, but that's not necessarily what you want.
To me, the most logical way would be you leave the rules on on options, and you remove the constructor that takes the rules themselves. So the only way you can pass stuff in is by options, and options are optional. So you can just say there's the defaults option. If you don't like them, you have to construct them and set them on the way you want. I mean, that's the kind of way, the way how JSON works, right?
That goes again against my gut feeling of that the rules are important. Like I want them to always be a formal parameter. In my gut. And so I left the ASN encoding rules constructor here because most people won't care about the other two options. So, but I think that there's only really two people in this part of the conversation, so we can probably work that out offline.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's a fair gut feel, right? I'm just judging it by how other readers work, right? But I guess most other readers are not multi-format, right? They're usually single format, and then it's like, well, you're reading XML, you already know that, so you don't have to specify that much. But yeah.
Because I think. Go ahead, Levi.
Oh, and I'm actually just looking at what we did for JsonSerializer right now, but I think they're probably different enough where the pattern doesn't really match. So okay,
so I think my gut inclination to avoid the default, or that you defaulted into a set of rules, is make the second constructor take an encoding rules and a reader options, and get rid of the encoding rules from the reader options.
Right.
That makes sense to me.
And then you would make the options default, right?
I either default or overload. I don't remember how we feel about constructors having defaults.
I mean, to me, it's the same as any other method.
Okay. So.
Just out of curiosity, Jeremy, options being a struct instead of a class, that was also intentional?
Because it was only one int big.
Okay.
My nod to low allocation.
Sure.
need to get a new computer.
Also, it meant that you didn't have to, or that as a struct, it has the bonus of no one should have the feeling that they get to change it after the fact and have that matter because it was a struct, so it was passed by value. But that was a side point.
Sure. Yeah, from a performance perspective, I don't really care. I just making sure that it was an intentional design decision. So great.
Yep. Okay, so I think we're down to the writer. I guess the names of the two things on the reader options were very verbose of skip, set, sort, order verification, and UTC time 2-digit year max to express what role they serve in the reader. In the overloads that let you override the value you gave in the option, they use they're not as verbose because there's the context of the method name. Then otherwise we're at the writer. All right, so there was a comment in a previous review of that sometimes it's useful to drain one writer into another. So I added a copy to because that's the name that we said that we wanted. And then essentially it's the same formula. All the overloads collapse into one with a default. And then there is a thing in the writer. Go ahead, Emo.
So the writer does not actually hold on to the thing it writes to, right? You always pass in the array where you basically write to, correct?
The writer maintains its own buffer, and then when it's done, you can try and encode it into your buffer, or there's encode, which is return me a copy of the buffer.
I see.
But
yeah, I'm kind of
because
curious how copy
caller
works, because I mean I'm not seeing any data that you're passing to the constructor, so I'm wondering how you actually copy anything.
So copy to would be, it's the same as calling encode or write encoded value of, so destination.write encoded value of this dot encode, except it avoids the intermediate arrays.
I'm still not following. I mean, so when I call copy to, what is actually what happens?
It writes the data that it would have returned in a new array to encode into the new writer as if you called write encoded value.
Oh, okay. So then the writer basically has its own private data that basically magically grows as you're writing to it, and then copy to basically just writes what you have said you have given it so far to the other writer.
Right, and
gotcha.
We could instead of copy to, if now looking at it you're like, wow, this feels really weird, it could be removed, or an overload to write encoded value, which would change the source and destination. So it would be destination.write encoded value this meta, or in a, yeah.
And what happens when I call copy to and then followed by encode? Is encoding giving me an empty array, or is this giving me the exact same data that you just wrote to copy to?
It would give you the same data. The data is preserved and is still growable until you call reset, at which point it just goes back to the empty internal buffer.
That makes sense. Okay. I mean, it's a bit odd, but like
a span of the internal buffer rather than.
Nope. Do not return spans that are not provided by the caller.
So this is not intended to be used in any performance critical areas?
Do not return spans that are not provided by the caller.
That's not always true, Jeremy.
That's the short rule written down, and it is a very firm belief that I have. So I can't write an API that violates it.
There are plenty of places where you've got some static cache data or something, and it's perfectly reasonable to return a span.
Fair enough, but in this case, it's growable arrays. So if it returned the span, it could immediately be invalidated, and it was originally using the array pool, which is the worst kind of span to return.
That's fine. I'm just saying, like that high level rule is too summarizing.
Yeah,
I guess it's don't return a span unless it's there's a different than less, because we made it include the static array return property thing.
Yeah, so I think was it Corey earlier who mentioned the performance concerns?
Yes.
Because there's a reset method on this writer, you could actually just have your own private pool of these, or you could have a like a thread static writer and just reset it whenever you want to rerun it.
Yeah.
That should work just fine. So you'd still be able to use these high-level APIs in a performance-critical scenario.
Okay,
I mean, you still have to copy at the end, but
them copies are fast, though. It's not a huge concern.
Are we expecting the buffer to be relatively small so that we wouldn't care about copying?
I mean, it depends on what you're doing. Certainly, if you build a signed CMS with an embedded payload and what you've signed is a 2 gig file, then this has a 2 gig buffer. But if you're building a certificate, that comes out to like 3K. So the expected value is 4K or less, but there is no upper bound.
Yeah, and a mem copy of 4K is not going to be measurable in any real world application.
Well, it depends on how often you do it, but yeah.
If you're generating ASN1 payloads like that frequently inside your application, like what on earth are you doing?
I mean, that's but I guess that goes back to Corey's point, right? Like if you expect this to be in a hot loop, then if a typical buffer size is 4K, then that's probably not going to be acceptable, right? If you expect this to happen like 1,000 times, where in a given process lifetime, then it's probably going to be fine, right? But
even in a hot loop, like a 4K mem copy is really not going to hurt you. Like processors are really, really, really good at mem copy.
Yeah, and I mean, essentially, if it returned a span, you're probably copying that into your destination buffer anyway, so you would be doing the copy. So instead, you just try and code into the destination buffer you were gonna do the copy into.
Yeah, I mean, I'm generally agreeing with your point of like if you have a global array, like handing out span seems like a recipe to shoot yourself very badly. So in that sense, it seems very similar to list of T, where we basically decided against it. But like I think the conclusion is if we ever really discover that this type needs to be used in the context of a super hot loop, then I guess the shape of the type is not really amenable for doing that, right? You would have to create a different type that does that.
I mean, we could easily extend it to this one. It's the caller would have to provide the buffer as a constructor parameter, and then now it's theirs. And
is there any reason why we couldn't do the same thing we did with the reader, where you basically have a bunch of statics that somebody can write something on top of?
So when we get to most of the primitives, that works fine. But the nested content types, you don't know what I'll just assume all bytes or all tags are 1 byte. You don't know what the second byte is until you know what the last byte is.
That's
because
a great design, yeah.
Well, it's made for very fast readers. This encoding set is made on the assumption that you read something more often than you write it.
I see. Yeah, I guess that's.
And so everything's length prepended, and so for nested payload types, you don't know what the length is until you're done.
Yeah, I mean, you could have
an API where you basically take an iBuffer writer as a constructor.
So if we ever get the need, maybe. But again, I don't.
I feel like we're designing for a scenario that doesn't exist.
Right.
I guess that's fair. Like I'm just trying to assess because for the reader, we basically said, okay, we have a static helper because we don't want to give people a ref struct reader, but if they ever need one, they can easily build one, right? And here we are saying, oh no, we don't need that, and that seems just like at the surface at least, inconsistent, right? If we believe we always have way more readers than writers, and writers are not performance critical, then I think that's fine.
And there are ways that we could deal with it in the future. Of take a iBuffer writer, take a buffer, add static encode methods for all of the primitive types, and then you're on your own, or we figure something else out for the nested types. But yeah, right. there is growth here that doesn't require returning the span.
I'm fine with that. It's just a little weird. It's kind of a low-level API, but it's doing its own allocation and copying. It seems like a mismatch to me. But if it's not a critical path, we can add it later if it's needed.
Yeah, it's more a really hard to get correct, just above the lowest of low level. So
yeah. It also depends on what you mean by low level, right? I mean, memory stream is relatively low level and it does the exact same thing, right? It basically happily allocates for you. I think as long as people are clear that that's what happens, but it kind of, as I said earlier, like it seems implied because you don't give it anything, right? So clearly it has to send the data somewhere, right? It shouldn't be an entirely a mystery to the caller that this thing allocates.
Okay, so if you scroll a little bit, we'll see the first thing that's returning a scope. So push octet string.
Oh, here we go.
So all the push methods in this version all return a scope. Scope is a nested type inside the writer. It's a struct that is idisposable and has no other public members. And so what scope does is if you say using push octet string, then when that using exits, it calls the pop octet string for you, and then it's safely idempotent and other stuff. So it's just letting your logical scopes and your lexical scopes be the same thing.
Any reason why you have a pop octet string then?
I left it in case for some reason somebody wants to write the linear code and not use the using statement.
Yeah. I mean, my only concern is that this accidentally results in double pops, right? That seems the...
Yeah, if you manually call pop and then dispose the scope, it's a no-op. If you dispose the scope and then call pop, it'll throw a stack imbalanced exception. Well,
eventually.
Yeah, the invalid operation exception for you called pop when that's not the current context. I mean, unless you happen to have done push octet string twice. But yeah, so I mean, I can hide the pop. I can, editor browsable hide the pop, but it.
I mean, for symmetry, I give you that it looks nicer to have both. It seems odd to only have one, but then again, it seems
a
little bit odd to have both at the same time when people... Like, am I expected to... I mean, it might not be clear to people that they push, dispose, and pop, right? Because that seems... like, it's not clear to me that disposing a scope pops, right? That's the other thing. I guess it's... maybe it's just the naming. But yeah.
Yeah, and maybe we want to leave it as void push and come up with another verb for the scope. But
yeah, I guess in general I don't have a problem with the pattern where we use idisposable as a glue for pairing up methods. My only concern is that people need to know that is what's happening, right? And so they don't do things twice. I mean, granted, it's probably not a big deal because if you do it twice, then you will immediately find out that something is not working, right? So it's not like there's a sudden unexpected bug in your program that you will find very late.
Right. So leave it as is.
I don't have a better idea. If anybody else does anybody else have an opinion in this space?
I don't think it's really hurting anything being there, to be honest.
Yeah, like if somebody, I mean, as you said, Emo, if somebody calls it So if they call it inside the using, so if they use a using and they call it inside, the pop or the dispose is resilient to that. If they do it in the wrong order, then they'll almost immediately get an exception as they were like they wrote the code, they tested the code, it blew up in their face. And certainly the API docs that I've written on it says returns a thing that calls pop for you when it's disposed.
Yeah, and I think if we look at the JsonSerializer or the JsonWriter as a pattern to follow here, I believe they did something similar, where there are multiple ways to kind of close an object scope, but like Jeremy said, you'll find it very early in testing. This isn't something that's going to bite you in production unless you literally never tested your code.
Yeah, that doesn't seem like the code that you write once and then just push and walk away, right?
Yeah. Since generally you wrote it and then sent it to a reader somewhere that then told you they couldn't read the thing that you wrote. And then you squint at the spec again and find the byte that you were missing. Not that that's ever happened to me. So all of the pushables, which are octet string, sequence, and set of, return the same opaque scope value. Sorry, same opaque scope type. Certainly it has a different value. And it should be the last major structural change. There's scope in its glory.
I'm curious, how the heck did you make it idempotent?
It remembers enough state to be able to verify if it's already done.
But it's a read-only struct. How do you remember that you already did something?
Because it, as a nested type, it has access to the writer's state. So the reference type that it's holding on to is the writer, and the int that it's holding on to is where was I in the state? Does it look like I'm still there?
I see.
Generally speaking, if struct idisposables need to be resilient against double dispose, that state needs to be in whatever they're wrapping, not in the struct itself. Because when you make a copy of the struct, the state gets duplicated.
I see.
Yes, it's hard to be idempotent if everything is a struct, but in this case, I have a reference type that can hold the state for me. Or rather, I'm a reference type that I'm comparing the state against.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then, yeah, tag class got bigger because it could.
It doesn't seem like a great justification, but yeah. Oh my god, you're literally in a 1 hour segment. It's I was not prepared for that. So why did the values all change? Oh, they didn't. You just moved to an int. I see. Okay. Yeah.
The feedback was it doesn't need to be byte, so just be the standard int. So it got bigger because it could.
The tag class and the tag number are basically ORed together and emitted into the stream. Is that how that works?
If your tag number is less than 31, yes.
Okay.
Modulo the primitive / constructed bit.
Sure.
So if your tag number is less than 31, then it ORs the two things together, and ORs together or ORs in the constructed bit if needed. If you hit 31, then life becomes complicated.
Okay. But it sounds like on the wire in general, this was meant to fit into a single octet in general.
Yes, I think until the, I don't know if it was the 2015 version of the spec or the one before that. Nothing had a number bigger than 30, and there are definitely well-known operating systems that may or may not always assume that it fits in 1 byte.
Okay.
How was that? Pointing fingers.
It's more like pointing a fist, but yes.
Right. So then, let me just quickly check one thing. I think God. I don't know what I did, but for some reason, Teams is now at 60% of utilization. There's something really fundamentally wrong.
Oh, so you somehow reduced it from 90. Congratulations.
Well, my machine is at 100%, but the rest is going down for OBS, so I don't quite know what's happening here. But every time I type, I can literally congratulate every single character by hand. Oh my god, thank you.
So, Emo, since this is in designs, and what we reviewed was a comment on designs, should I update the design to match what we did and then close or commit the PR?
Yeah, so I was about to say that. So like, I consider at this point we're done with the AsnReader one. I would just consider it approved. The way we usually track designs is that we approve a particular snapshot of a design, right? And if later on changes need to be made, it's a separate PR and then it's a separate approval, right? That's, I think, the easiest way to deal with that.
Yep.
And yeah, I guess ideally this would have not been a comment, but just a PR. But I guess in this case, the div would have been awful. So yeah,
right.
It is what it is.
Yeah, I mean that was the when do we merge a design that where you asked and I said, what do you want me to do? So okay, so I'll update the content that's there and then we'll deal with that.
All right. So I think, is Naomi on the call, by the way?
Yes, I am.
Perfect. Do you want to talk to this one?
Yeah, for sure. One moment.
Sorry to put you on the spot, but I honestly did not expect this to finish. I expected us to take 2 hours.
Okay, so last week we discussed this. So this issue is to discuss having ignore default value semantics for JsonSerializer. Currently, we have ignore null value, but no way to apply this to value types. So if you scroll all the way to the last comment, there was some feedback last week regarding whether we should apply it to deserialization. So the gist is Steve and I spoke to James NK shortly after the meeting on Friday. And the feedback was, do we need to apply to deserialization? Does it make sense? But we basically said, hey, we sort of applied the semantics for Newtonsoft when we first designed ignore null values. So wanted to be sure whether it actually needed to be applied to deserialization. So after speaking with him, couldn't really think of a good reason why we should, which reflects some of the concerns from API review last week. And the sentiment is that most people probably do not notice that it's been applied or require for it to be applied. So that said, I updated the proposal to make it applicable only to serialization, and then fix up the concern with the ignore condition when null and how to specify that this will only apply to serialization. So the first thing here is JSON ignore condition already exists today. We have never, when null, and always. So proposal here is to rename when null to when writing default values, which is very clear that this will, if the condition is set to this per property, then would only ignore when writing null values, meaning that if null is applied on deserialization, would apply it. If null is in payload. So that's the first thing. So if we scroll down to the next question is, what does this look like globally? So we use this enum globally as well. Say we have a default ignore condition. Initially, I named this so default ignore condition. So this determines when to ignore default values on serialization and deserialization. So we have the same options, and the default to be JSON ignore never, meaning that would always serialize and deserialize default values. So if one wanted to per property ignore a value on serialization if it's default, then they would set it to when writing default values. So this is nice because we're able to add when reading default values and when default values in the future if we ever need it, and it's explicit. So the final thing about the proposal was to make ignore default values obsolete. So this initially was specific to null values. Now we have a more generalized thing that applies to serialization and deserialization. So perhaps we don't need this anymore, especially since we're concerned about it applying to deserialization as well. The ideal plan for me personally would be to make this obsolete for this release, and then in .NET 6 remove it, since like the library is fairly new, and then would have obsoleted it. So they have one full release cycle to, and then wouldn't advertise this option and just have people start toward the new global option. So that's this is just applying feedback from last week to see if any questions.
Yeah, I don't know that you'll ever be able to actually remove it, but you can. Obsoleting it isn't as much of a problem.
That's right.
Yeah, I think we said this last time. I think I'm also somewhat skeptical that removal will ever be viable. But I think the design makes sense to me. Does anybody have any concerns with that? It certainly is kind of where I was hoping we would land.
Yeah, I think the overall shape is reasonable. I wonder if the when writing default values should not have the S on the end, because it applies to this property and this property's default value, or as the default, then it's for every particular property its default value, but it's not. There is no notion of plural on a per property for default.
Yeah, it's just weird when it's applied globally to see singular. That's the thing.
Yeah, but I think that the word, or the fact that it says it's the default ignore condition when writing default value, I think that in my head that feels grammatically accurate to get rid of the S.
But having the S matches the S at the end of always.
Touche. When always, yes, always write it down.
I mean,
and
then my kill level is low because I think either one would work, but I don't know. Do we have a rule
I'm just
for
thinking
that?
of it as sitting on an attribute sitting on a property of when writing default values, because the plural doesn't feel to me like it applies to this property, so it feels like it's a mode question instead of the value question. Like, so when I read it, it feels like a state to me instead of a value comparison.
It could be interpreted to mean for every instance of this property across the object, default values for all those. But it's the one thing, I guess. So maybe that doesn't make any sense.
So from chat, someone suggested, what if you just leave off the value suffix entirely?
So when writing default? I think I like it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, I actually like it. It's also shorter.
It feels a little incomplete to me, but not enough that I'll say any more about it.
So thank you, Frederick, for that suggestion.
And then as a tedious nitpick thing, in your description of the default ignore condition for JSON serializer options, you say it'll be an invalid operation exception if you pass always. That should probably be an argument exception. Because you're not complaining about the state of the object, you're complaining about the value of the argument, so it should be an argument exception.
That makes sense to me.
So where do you see that?
In the XML doc for the
for the options, yeah.
Yeah, because presumably you're also throwing an argument exception if it's a value that's not defined. So it would be if you're going to throw the argument out of range if it's always or a value that's not defined.
Yep.
So. Otherwise, I think it looks good to me.
Bum, 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 bum. All right, so then
Thank you.
all right, so I think there's one more JSON related item, right? This one here. So it's marked as blocking, so that's why I'm going over it.
Yep. Hey. Can you click on the second link that talks about the reference resolver proposal?
So this one here?
No, the second one.
This one?
Yeah, in the comment, yeah.
Thanks, teams. What is happening here? Why is it?
No, that's another one. It was the previous one.
Yeah, I don't know why the other one popped open though. That seems almost like it scrolled back.
Oh, you can scroll at the bottom.
Try this one more time. No touching the keyboard. All right, seems to have worked.
All right, so on top of the reference handling original proposal, I wanted to add a reference resolver, which is essentially something that we already have internally. That is just the backup references where we have where we keep all the objects, all the reference type objects that we have that we found on serialization or deserialization. So what I wanted to do is to expose the reference resolver as an abstract class, similar to what NewtonSoft has. And a few reasons for this is that someone might want to define how they store their references. For example, someone wants to root the references, and they can achieve that by just creating the resolver out of the serialization state. Say they can just send it concurrently to the serializer. Another option will be to once the new conveyor model that Steve has worked on gets exposed, and that conveyor model exposes the state within the serialization, they can access the reference resolver and interact with it with the methods proposed. And also this proposal also addresses the previous feedback that we had about changing reference handling to reference handler, used to make this not look like an enum and more like a class, to sound like a class more than an enum. So maybe you want to scroll a little bit down to the examples or to the proposal. So basically, I'm adding the reference resolver class with four methods to interact with it, and in order to enable that, I'm also adding a constructor for the reference handler class that takes a func, and in that func you can use so to get the references to not root, you can use delegate the reference handler constructor to the func, And in order to get that reference to root, you just create an instance, a static instance, so just an instance out of the serialization state and just pass that frequently into the func. And that's pretty much it. And also keep in mind that when you call the reference handler, this new reference handler constructor, you will be the serializer will infer that you are preserving references, right? Can you scroll down a little bit more, just for examples?
Sorry, just for this one, or do you have samples? Is that what you said?
Yeah. So for example, here, someone might want to use, instead of ints, which is what we have, someone might want just to use GUIDs, and for that they use cast the string on the JSON into the GUID and just keep it on a dictionary. And to emit the ID, they just create a new GUID and return it on the get reference method. Right.
Could you scroll back up for a second to the definition? A little higher. So reference handler has these two defaults, which presumably have a built-in resolver. Like it's like you were constructing a reference handler with some func that returned a new resolver. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
So default doesn't preserve any references, presumably, right? So you can probably override the methods and return null. And then preserve would do it via int. Is that fair?
Yes.
Interesting.
Well, also keep in mind that default does not create a resolver, right? Because it's not going to preserve anything.
Right.
What?
So can you then return null from this func? And then basically get the behavior of default?
Well, you are not reference handler is sealed. You are not implementing. I mean, you are not inheriting from reference handler. You should have to inherit from reference resolver.
No, I know, but I mean, but basically, could I create a reference handler and passing in a func, and that func returns null? Is that legal? Because that would be logically the equivalent of default, right? Or is the idea that you have to literally...
Yeah, no, it's not legal. Yeah, I assume that we can throw like invalid operation on that case.
I see.
And presumably, the way this is defined, there's some internal rather than public method that actually invokes the func?
Yes.
Okay.
Does the func itself need to be provided any kind of state that the serializer, like serializer options, something along those lines?
Okay, can you repeat that?
So it sounds like for each time I call serialize, the serializer will invoke this func to get a potentially fresh instance of the resolver, correct?
Yeah,
but
correct.
No state is passed into this call site. Does the resolver need any information whatsoever from the serializer in order to create a new instance of itself?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't need any information for create an instance.
I guess the general idea is if you need any state, you have to create the closure for yourself, right?
No, but so creating the closure means that I'm capturing state at the time that I'm registering the resolver. What I was wondering is there any information specific to a given serializer instantiation that needs to be flowed in here? And it sounds like the answer is no.
Well, there was a consideration just to pass a bool, just to know when if you call this from serialize or deserialize, just to know what dictionary you want to initialize. But I discussed that with Aswan. And seems like that's like not really necessary and just a little bit more confusing than necessary, right?
Also, the options are locked after the first serialization, so they shouldn't change. So if you had the options the first time, then you probably don't need it again for subsequent serializations, I don't think.
Yep.
In other words, you could capture that yourself if you needed them during deserialization.
So one of the things that we also discussed offline was if you create the reference resolver for particular options, that could cause, essentially memory leak, because the options are probably used throughout, the executable or app domain. So that may or may not be the intent, to share the same references across everything, right? But we don't have today a nice way to scope it just for a particular entry point that's called, normally you call it, JsonSerializer, serializer, deserialize. There's not today any object to kind of hook onto that would say, for the lifetime of only this serializer, deserialize, I want to preserve references. You're missing, that's missing today. It was mentioned a little earlier that, I was working on a design that we have that state thing, and you can maybe hook up to that. But just to note that if somebody decides to create, their own static or something tied to an options class, they could get into trouble. And
so does that mean that every reference resolver needs to be thread safe?
Yeah.
It depends how it's saving these.
Well, let's go down to the GUID example below.
Well, I don't think it would be thread safe, right? The instance is specific for this particular deserialization, right?
Yeah.
Because because the func is invoked per serialize, deserialize. The reference handler is shared, but not the actual resolver is.
Yeah, it sounds like the provider has to be thread safe, but not the resolver itself.
Yeah.
Okay. And the provider is generally just new whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Unless someone wants to root them.
But I mean, I had a similar feeling. Like, to me, raw funcs are nice if you're really absolutely positively sure you never need anything more, right? As soon as you don't want to pass in anything else, you're kind of screwed with that design. Because now you would have to, I mean, you're not entirely screwed. You could have an overload to reference handler, right, that takes a func of something else, right? But yeah, maybe it's good enough. I mean, if you're fairly confident we don't need to pass in any state, it's fine. Otherwise, an abstract base type might be better.
Well, as you said, adding an overload that takes that's func of state to handler would work.
Right.
You just deprecate this one and say call the new one if you need to. Like, it's not the worst thing in the world.
No, it's not.
Just to confirm, so every time the serializer does a serialization or deserialization, it invokes this func. It gets a reference resolver. It uses it for that serialization, deserialization instance, and that only, and then it drops it on the floor. Yes, or true or false?
I hope it's true.
It's false, I think. I mean, David, you can reply, but we don't clear it at the end of a serialization.
Yeah, no, do you save it past the operation?
No, we don't save it past the operation. So the only reason to leave after serialization will be to have it out of the serialization call, right? So instead of just delegating to the constructor, you just pass in the instance.
So there is a potential pit of failure here then, where right now we expect people to pass within the func itself, like open close paren arrow operator new my resolver. But if someone says var resolver equals new my resolver, and then they pass open paren close paren arrow, that instance that I instantiated as part of a closure, they now have a memory leak inside their application, and they won't notice that memory leak until their app at some point in the future falls on the floor dead.
Or they create a static instance and their delegate is just open paren, close paren, arrow, s_blah.
Yeah, I added that to the proposal. I don't know if you want to scroll down a little bit more. And I think what we can do for that is to maybe create an analyzer rule just to check that people is actually opting into not doing a new operation on the func. Would that be good enough?
I mean, maybe I'm not quite understanding. It's like, but even if you were to return a static, right? The func is still scoped to this instance of options, right? If I drop these options on the floor and I create new JsonSerializer options with different settings, then I also don't have a memory leak, right? I only have a memory leak if the options themselves now also are effectively a static, correct?
If you serialize, you make one set of options and you serialize multiple times. This collection is just growing and growing and growing and growing and growing.
Right.
And then eventually the dictionary can't allocate anymore and it ooms.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is,
in the case on the screen, the resolver is shared across all instances of all options that are created with deserialized people.
Sorry, that was so fast. Can you say it one more time?
So this deserialized people method is using the same underscore resolver every time it creates,
right,
for every operation that's performed.
Right.
So all operations from now until eternity that call deserialized people are using this same underscore resolver instance.
David
So
wasn't
always grow.
Oh,
and,
I see. Yes, because this guy has a dictionary and that lets grow indefinitely. Yes.
And it's going to be called concurrently because,
right.
I mean, assume that this was a BCL method. It's static, so it's thread safe. And now that means the resolver instance had to, that instance, which normally wouldn't have had to be thread safe, does have to be thread safe in order to preserve the thread safety of the static method.
Right. I mean, so I agree.
Are we trying to enable the scenario where someone reuses this? I'm wondering if we should instead have a generic factory with a new constraint and it just, activate or create instance the type.
Actually, yeah, there is someone that is actually asking for passing in the same instance.
The problem with that approach is now this guy cannot hold on to any state, right? So now if you need to pass in any state to your resolver, you're kind of screwed in that model.
Not necessarily, because the thing is we want to make it easy for someone to do the common case and possible for someone to do the uncommon case, but not. We don't want people to run into a situation where we force them to use a complex API and they accidentally get it wrong. So I could see a world where both of these exist, both the easy one that Steve suggested and the complex one that David just talked about.
So, for example, you would say reference handler equal JSON reference handler dot create of T, and that is a activator create instance T. Basically, yeah.
And that would be the one that we direct the common case to. And then we tell people, like, if you really need to customize this for whatever reason, func it.
I see.
I wonder how that's going to show up in auto caption.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I mean, I'm not sure how big of a bit of failure that is, because it seems like, why would you cache the resolver yourself? That seems kind of
it's would people accidentally do it? Like I know that people on the stream can't see this, but I posted into chat 2 different variants of how to register a resolver. They both look innocuous. One of them will lead to an within your application.
Eventually. I mean, if you only deserialize once, it's fine. But
I mean, if you have a web service, presumably you're calling this over and over and over.
I think the problem, and this is kind of alluded to before, is that the serializer doesn't have a concept of a state object. It has this options thing, right, which isn't not intended to hold state. It's, on there to hold your options. So if you have a func hanging off of that does hold state, they're kind of coupled. And today there is no state object created when you call serialize, or that lets you pass in a state object. But if that was added, I think that would be, the place that you would want to tie your resolver to, or your handler to, because then it'd be up to the caller to say, hey, I'm passing in this special state that I want to preserve between multiple calls to the serializer. It's very explicit. It's just that we don't have today, so that's why it is what it is right now. And this,
Yeah. I mean, my gut feel is that the func is good enough, but I can see the argument. I mean, like the second example Levi had, right, where you basically close over a local variable and this whole thing gets hosted somewhere. Seems also in the general case fine, because it usually means it's tied to the invocation of that method, right? I mean, unless that method is literally the entirety of your program, where effectively the hosted instance is stacking around for a long time, that also seems relatively fine. I mean,
let me give a counterexample there. I'm writing an ASP.NET application where I create the options once within my program startup routine. I pass it to ASP.NET, and then it just reuses that options over and over and over again. If I've now additionally closed over a singleton resolver inappropriately, I now have potential thread safety issues and issues within my application, which my testing might not catch.
See, I guess that's a fair argument, right? Because you would register this usually in basically the startup method, right? Which, yeah, that's only one in the whole application, which is not good.
Yeah.
By the way, Emo, you're currently streaming your chat window instead of the talking heads.
Streaming my chat window.
And Dave, do you want to talk about the Newtonsoft issue in ASP.NET that you fixed recently?
Sure. So actually, ASP.NET stepped into that issue with Newtonsoft because they were caching the JsonSerializer itself as an instance for perf, and by caching the whole JsonSerializer, they are also caching the resolver. So every time you do a new request, they will just keep adding to the resolver over and over, and they will eventually reach outbound memory ground, right, out of memory.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, the func is reasonable for somebody who needs to do a complicated thing, but I think Steve has the right idea that we should make an accelerator somewhere that just takes a T.
Yeah.
So reference resolver factory of T, or reference resolver factory dot create of T, or something that just returns the func for you and makes it so that, like, because essentially, we said, we can write an analyzer that complains if you don't use the word new in this func. I mean, well, that means that we need a better way of doing it.
It seems like the easiest way to do it is you just have a create method on reference handler that takes a T, and that T is a reference resolver, and that returns a reference handler.
Yeah. You'd probably want this to be a create method as well, rather than a constructor parameter that takes a func. Sorry, I spoke over you.
Okay, well then you will, so you will not be able to do the example that we were mentioning about reusing the same instance on different serialization calls, right?
Well, you could, like, we can leave the func constructor here, but then you could also say reference handler having a static creative T that just builds the func. Nothing goes to new T.
Yeah, or have both be a create method, one of which takes a T and one of which takes a func of T.
Yeah.
Right. Although arguably, when you have both, they're equally convenient, right? So like the argument still holds that if people see the other overload, maybe they like. I'm not sure that the generic one looks simpler, basically.
Yeah. I'm not sure anyone's ever said that functions taking functions were easy.
Well, I think the problem is the context, right? Because if you look at what Levi said earlier, right? If in the context of ASP.NET, in your startup method, funcs are fairly popular or fairly common, right? So like if that's and that's basically when you accidentally close over a local, then you really kill yourself, right? And I think that's where my concern is, because in ASP.NET in the configuration thing, like everything, like a lot of things take funcs. So it's a fairly common pattern there. So that's why I think people might accidentally just, when they see them both as overloads, they would just take that one.
Maybe, but then you kind of have to make two mistakes in a row. First, you have to gravitate towards the more complicated overload, and then you have to do the wrong thing with that overload.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm not sure it's a mistake though, right? Because that's what I'm saying in ASP.NET. It's so common that it's just, that's all if you have to write 10 method calls, write an 8 of them are
right. I mean, we could also have, so get rid of the public constructor once we're having the static creates. But the reference handler.create of t, which takes the t as a t with a constraint of new and has no arguments, and reference handler.create manually, which takes a func reference resolver. So you had to write the word manually before you get to the one that takes the lambda.
Yeah.
Or just make reference handler abstract, have reference handler of t be concrete sealed. And if you want to implement your own handler, like you subclass it and override the create resolver method. Like no funcs involved anywhere there.
Sorry, say this last part again. Like you would introduce a type that basically is the factory. Is that what you're saying?
So reference handler becomes abstract. You create a concrete sealed implementation reference handler of t, constrain the t to both reference resolver and new. And if I really want to customize how these things are created, I subclass reference handler and override the create resolver method.
Oh yes, I like that. Because then
it's a typical object-oriented pattern, no func.
Because then it's like if you really want this, you can, but now you talk about 10 lines of code rather than 2, right? So that seems reasonable. Yeah, I think I like that. And then basically reference handler.create of t is basically the thing that everybody's using because that's super convenient and it does the right thing.
Well, you don't even need create t. You can just new reference handler of t. Like that's the easiest way to create one of these things, right?
New reference handler of GUID reference resolver, close angle bracket, open paren, close paren.
Yeah, that reads more naturally for our developer audience. I mean, I'm not interested in shutting down the scenario, right? I'm just interested in making sure that people don't accidentally do the wrong thing.
Think about it now. I think that makes sense to me. So let me just sketch it and then we can talk about whether we like it or not.
So Levi, so you're suggesting to make so you make abstract reference handler and if someone wants to use this custom preserve, they need to inherit from reference handler, right? But I mean, we consider I consider merging or doing abstract the reference handler class and get rid of reference resolver. I mean, like just moving the methods to reference handler, but then if you add something else to reference handler, it wouldn't make sense.
Well, reference handler still stays the factory. But instead of taking a func, it gains a public abstract reference resolver create resolver method. And so if you want to do, I have custom options that need to go into my resolver or anything weird, then you would extend reference handler so that in your create resolver you can do whatever complicated things you needed to. But if you just want the easy thing, you would say your handler was reference handler of GUID resolver.
Okay, cool.
And this one would have this guy here. So almost there.
Okay, wait. But then again, let's assume that in the future, we discussed before that some people might want to add the ignore option. So if you want to, I don't know, for example, if you want to have reference handler with ignore, and then you have this reference resolver.create, well, I guess you can return null. I mean, you can just override it to return null and just enable ignore in case we add ignore in the future. Does that make sense?
Wouldn't ignore be a static singleton?
Well, yeah, but wouldn't then people be confused?
Well,
that maybe they can also customize the ignore behavior.
You wouldn't be able to customize the ignore behavior if it's a static singleton because it gives you back a reference handler.
Okay.
I mean, like what would you be ignoring?
Oh, well, ignore is a separate option, and instead of doing preserve, it ignores the references, right?
But what's that mean?
Today you get an exception, right? If we see that stuff.
Well, we don't have ignore. Today we don't expose ignore. That's just on JSON.NET.
I mean, if you have reference IDs in your JSON today and you deserialize it with the default, we throw, right?
No, we send that to the JSON exception data overflow because we don't.
Well, that's what I thought ignore was for. So, okay.
Okay, never mind.
Imo, on line 14, you need to add a reference resolver constraint to T.
So where?
On that line, add a reference resolver constraint to T.
Yeah, new comma reference resolver, or reference resolver comma new. I don't remember if there's a canonical order.
Yeah, I can't remember. Like this, right?
And then on line 11, create resolver would also probably be protected, right?
Could be. I mean, either way.
Why wouldn't it be public?
Why would it be public?
Because if I'm creating my own, if I'm customizing the serializer, I might need to call this in order to get a reference handler, would I not? Or in order to get the resolver?
You mean you're writing your own serializer?
Sure, if I'm writing my own serializer, or if in the future we ever intend on adding extensibility hooks to the serializer.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, like if it took parameters, then I'd say it should use the template method pattern. So it would be protected abstract create resolver core. But since it doesn't take any, if we don't expect that we're going to be adding overloads, then public seems fine. Like, because it'll need to be called by the serializer, and yeah, we could make it
internal
protected internal. Yes,
yeah.
FAM or a SIM. So we could do that so that we could work around it, and certainly if someone extended the type, they could then make a sibling method that made it public. But I don't see a reason that we would need to. I don't think protected helps, I guess.
Yeah, I was just saying, but I mean, if you want to test it, right, you can easily construct a unit test if you really wanted to. I mean, I don't know, like it doesn't bias anything. I agree with that. Just you make people jump through hoops now.
All right. What about down in reference resolver itself, the string reference ID? That mean we're creating a unique string for every object?
Yeah.
We already do that?
Yep, we do that on the default reference resolver.
And that's not an issue, performance-wise?
No, not really. I mean,
we need a string to write it out anyway.
Yeah.
To JSON.
Right, but how are you? Is there a separate? I'm deserializing off the wire, and I have 1,000 references to the same instance. Am I creating 1,000 strings in order to call this 1,000 times?
Yeah, I mean, you are casting an int to a string 1,000 times, I guess, because that's the ID that we have on the default reference resolver.
We could, as an optimization, just like cache the strings 1 through 20 or something, and make both the default reference resolver and the serializer aware of this.
If they're encoded in their canonical UTF-8 non-escaped representation?
Well, this would have to be unescaped anyway.
What I guess I'm wondering if we're creating a string from something. What are we creating the string from?
From an int.
Why isn't this just indexed by int?
Then.
Let me try. Like, isn't the idea that the resolver is the party that decides what that string is, right? Basically, you're calling get reference, and then I say this is the string representation, right? In my GUID example, it's the 2-string version of the GUID. The default one would use the 2-string of an int, and whatever other encoding I want to have for my instances, that's basically what I am responsible for, right? So the resolver is the one deciding what the string is.
I think there's a mismatch here because get reference is called during serialization, add reference is called during deserialization.
Right, because you basically own both sides, right?
Yes. So when you're reading stuff from the wire, the incoming $ID is a string, which maybe an int if that's how it was written out, but it could also be the word foo.
Right.
All right, so it's not actually integers; it's arbitrary data on the wire.
Yeah.
Yeah, that the resolver put in, right?
Whatever get reference decided to write. It could be using, base 62 encoding to minimize space on the wire.
Yeah, but to Steve's point though, so it might make sense to take a span or a memory here, but the problem with that is presumably the resolver is going to have a dictionary backing its data, and span and memory really don't work well with dictionary.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing for the highest perf that you would want would be the read-only span of byte, but then somebody would have to run it through an escaper to work out the JSON escaping because you could write. I mean, something can come in from the wire where literally every character uses the \u syntax, and that's legal, and so it needs to handle that. So I don't think we can really do better than string and still have any modicum of usability.
I mean, you could pass in basically the whatever the representation of the JSON UTF-8 reader is, right? And then just say you are responsible for taking this thing out in whatever representation you see fit.
Right, but that would be that you'd have to run it through the JSON string de-escaper.
Yeah, there are too many pits of failure there.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, like my gut feel is if you care about high performance, you probably shouldn't use the API to begin with.
Yeah, I mean that I was gonna say that too. If you're doing reference handling and you have a graph that has the same object in it 1,000 times, you're serializing wrong.
I think a common scenario, like if you use an entity framework, the string could be what your primary key is.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I mean, to Steven's point though, right? I think the problem is you effectively have to create the string for every single instance, right? Which, if the underlying value is an int, that's not particularly efficient, right? And for databases, it's almost always an int.
But we could address that though. If we needed to address that more generally, we could do that within the reader itself by having the reader keep like a small interned cache of strings that it's seen while deserializing this object graph. So if we were to solve that at the reader level, this would just get that benefit for free. We wouldn't have to special case this.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
And get reference is usually going to be returning. If it's from entity framework and it's the primary key, then it's probably pre-calculated, so it's not actually allocating anything to return. If it's doing a dictionary try get value, then what you stored was the key or the string form, then you've already computed that. So there's a lot of, even if you hit this 1,000 times, it's not necessarily that you're calling int.toString 1,000 times. You can that's on you.
No, I think get reference would be you would almost have to go out of your way to not make it unique per instance, right? Because you put this thing in a dictionary, you compute the thing, and you return the one, right? The next time you just look it up. The naive implementation would be interning by definition, right?
If you stored it as dictionary of object to int and then returned the toString yourself, then that's you made a smaller dictionary at the expense of a more expensive get reference.
Right.
And keep in mind 0 through 9.toString are cached anyway, so that might end up helping matters on the get reference side of things.
Yeah, if you only have 10 references though, it seems a bit.
By the way, sorry, I checked the default reference resolver that we have, and yeah, we do have the strings already computed, and so we just look them up and return them on the get reference. So there is no 1,000 to string calls, right?
All right.
And also, another difference from Newtonsoft is that the reference resolver is an interface, and we are having an abstract class. So, will it make sense to make this an interface?
Abstract class good, interface bad.
Abstract classes generally are preferred over interfaces because we can also add methods to them in a more realistic fashion.
Okay.
Because I think the only way we could add methods to interfaces is to use default interface implementations, which now means you can no longer target NetStandard 2.0.
Okay.
And I think we're scared of them.
Okay, so I think that is what we see on the screen then what we kind of like.
Yeah, I mean, I think line 16 would technically just be able to say new T because T had the new constraint, so you wouldn't need create instance, but otherwise, yes.
Fair enough. I mean, not that I care for the implementation, but yeah.
Yeah. And I assume that the reason that that it's one reference resolver and not one for serialize and one for deserialize is just because it makes the most sense to an implementer to have the same sort of dictionary and lookup semantics.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems odd to split that.
Well, internally there are two dictionaries, right? But yeah.
Yeah, because the code path they're using the resolver from is different, but
Right, but just making sure, because on the one hand it is a little clearer the relationship if it's split into two types, but I think everybody's implementation everybody would have the why do I have to write two types? I'm writing essentially the same code in read and write, so one type's good.
Scenarios to make sure that you can kind of round trip these IDs. Is that true, David? I mean, today we create a new integer every single run through, and depending on your object graph, you'll get different integers for the same object, and by using this feature and with a common cache that you can control, you can preserve the IDs across multiple calls.
Yes. Yeah. So, well, essentially with the func, now with the factory, you can preserve the IDs.
I mean, you could also just have your reference resolver type use a static dictionary, and that's what you chose to do as your implementation. So,
why would you want to reuse IDs across all instances?
Deterministic serialization.
Someone pointed that out in the example that we were discussing before, that someone might want to alleviate the memory that they need for when they do multiple serializations. So they don't send the whole object in a whole payload. They send it in multiple ones. So in order to know what the reference were on the multiple calls that they did, they choose to preserve the references.
Sure. So then they would have to deserialize in the same order.
Well, but wouldn't I guess as part of this, who's responsible for understanding uniqueness? Like, do you call when serializing, do you call get reference on every object in the graph?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, get reference and is reference. Before that, it's called on serialize, and add reference and resolve reference are called on deserialize.
So then so that means that you're actually creating an ID for every single object in the graph, even if it's never referenced, correct?
Yes. Well, except for structs, except for value types.
Yeah, but I mean, if I'm serializing something using this feature, presumably I have reference types, not value types. So this means potentially that going back to I think Steve's argument about performance earlier, should getting the ID of a particular object be deferred until it's actually necessary?
So this is a one pass algorithm. I mean, that would, I think, apply 2 passes.
It would.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's a one pass, and you could not defer it because you need to write $ID when you see the object, and then when you're going to reference it, you need to write $ref, and you need to have the same ID that you wrote before.
So
it's
instead
a
of
conflict point. Yeah.
instead of 2 calls, so looking at this, if what you're doing from your side is you call is referenced and then always unconditionally call get reference, assume that somebody's using a dictionary. You're dipping into the dictionary twice.
Yeah, exactly.
Would it make sense to be string get reference object value comma out bool first use?
Yeah, I step into that, but since that's different from Newton's stuff, and maybe someone wants to know if something is referenced before taking action, I split the calls into 2 methods. So that's more user friendly, I guess. So maybe if someone calls get reference, they might end up always adding a look for the object, which is probably something that someone might not want always.
Well, but I mean, if get reference gives the string and the have I seen this before, like, because really what you've written here is dictionary contains key followed by reading the dictionary. I mean, it's a little different, but that is like on anti-pattern 101.
Well,
that's a book you should write, Jeremy.
I have a parenthesis in the proposal where I exactly did what you were mentioning. So instead of having get reference and is reference, I added the string get reference object value out bool already exists. But as I said, that's now you cannot look up for the reference without adding to the dictionary.
But if you're always going to call get reference, wouldn't is there a scenario there? Like you're going to call get reference whether they return true or false.
Yeah.
So get reference doesn't know if is referenced return true or false unless they're depending on the absolute deterministic ordering of the methods that you're going to call and saving state between them, which seems like it's even better to have it just in one call.
Well, yeah, I don't have a concrete example for that. So, I mean, I was proposing the first also. So I don't have a strong opinion about changing to only get reference, to have only get reference instead of get reference and is reference, right? And yes, and the call sites that I saw on GitHub, they usually just do what you described, which is call is reference, and then call get reference, just to do the same logic that we will do normally with one single method.
Yeah, I think unless we can come up with a scenario where it's important to have them in 2 methods, I mean, again, if you're using this, performance is obviously not your highest goal, but custom equality comparisons can be expensive, and so double dipping the dictionary is not necessarily a good idea.
I see.
So I would recommend making get reference return both things, and it feels like the most natural representation of that is adding an out bool to what you currently have.
Okay.
Because try get reference feels weird.
No,
so I wouldn't like that one, because that would, get reference that outs. Is this the first time I've seen that object? Seems better because now the Boolean has a name, which tells you what it means.
So what you could do there then is instead of outing a bool, you could have an in bool, which is insert, or just tell me whether it exists. And if get reference returns null, it means it didn't exist.
But who would ever call it with I'm probing? Because the infrastructure is always going to call it with I need an ID for this, but you have to tell me if I'm writing down $ID or $ref.
I see.
It's either naming this object or referencing this object, but it always needs a name.
So you're saying that there's no need for a standalone query API. The only API you really need is add it unless it already exists, then tell me what was already there.
Yeah.
Okay. So add or get existing.
It's add or get existing that needs to give you both the ID and whether it added or got existing. So because the caller needs to know, do they need to write down the value still with $ref or $ID, or are they writing instead of the value $ref?
Okay, yeah, got it. That makes sense.
Keep in mind that this is actually how Newton's looks. So maybe it will make it more migration friendly when they try to pass in their code to our code. Wouldn't that be?
In general, how much are we trying to mimic that API?
Well,
I believe our goals were we will be inspired by it, but we will do the right thing for the platform instead of just copy the API.
Yeah, because I mean, if you tip the scale all the way to the other extreme, it's if you're satisfied with it, just keep using it, right?
Right.
So.
Okay, that's a good point.
So what does it mean for the API then?
Remove is referenced and add out bool.
Already exists.
Yeah.
So I out the bool where?
Out bool existing.
On get reference.
Like that.
Yeah. And now we can debate the word existing.
Existing. Okay.
I mean, existing already exists. We could invert the meaning and say first use or but something that conveys that this is saying the purpose of this Boolean is whether or not this object has been passed into this resolver previously.
I mean, maybe you can just say out bool already exists.
Sure.
Might be a slightly more readable. Apologies, my cleaning lady is apparently dismantling part of the house.
Means it's a thorough job.
Or she just declares bankruptcy. It's like, all right. Anything else, or is that it?
I mean, just on that note, then I mean, add reference. Is it ever? Is there any scenario that you'd want it like a triad to see if you've already added it?
I mean, the serializer should handle that, no?
Well, I mean, I think it would normally just replace it, I suppose.
That's presumably just whatever the resolver is going to do if two things are defined with the same ID.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, if people are calling this and they're not the implementer, if they would find out if they would care about the distinction.
Actually, we throw when we.
Oh. So internally we throw when that happens. Then.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. But that means we call get reference first then.
No, add reference is for deserialization.
Okay, so the dictionary itself, we if we add to it, we just throw. So
yeah, exactly.
You're using that version of the indexer or whatever that throws. Or we call triad and we throw
Yeah, we call try add, and if it's not added, we show that this is a duplicate ID.
Fair enough. All right, so I think it's probably good then.
Until it's not. All right, and then we are 12 minutes over, but at least we finished 3 items, so that's pretty good.
Thank you.
All right, guys, see you later. Bye-bye.